Good morning, everybody. My name is Sean Kirkwood, and I am with the City of Kansas City, Missouri.
I am Loranda Brewer. I'm also with the City of Kansas City, Missouri, and we work on
Landlord University, Landlord Tenant University. In this particular session today, we're going to be, with some of our colleagues in the work. They're from the Kansas City Housing Alliance, and today's topic is very relevant. We've been getting a lot of questions from both housing providers and tenants on how relationships can be better. We know that we're going through a global pandemic, and we know that we have a lot of issues that affect neighborhoods. And so what we don't want to have happen is, we want people in homes, we want people safe, we don't want people homeless. And sometimes the difference between somebody being homeless or not is, communication, is having a good relationship with folks who can provide those homes. And so at the City of Kansas City, we try to take care of and tend to the needs of both housing providers, tenants, homeowners, and all in between. So in these sessions, these tenant landlord sessions, we want to make sure that we offer a place where we can have intelligent conversation. We can provide factual based information. We want to work with our community partners who are also ingrained in the work. And today we have some great community partners that are going to help us answer some questions. And they're going to, kind of give us some instructions on how housing providers and tenants can work together for the betterment of neighborhoods. So today's panelists, we have Ms. Stacy Johnson Cosby, who's also with the Kansas City Regional Housing Alliance. And then we have Mr. Robert Long, who's with Landlords Incorporated. And both of these folks today have been in the work for quite a long time. I want to let them give us a brief, a brief monologue on the work they've been involved in, and they're going to take us through the work. Feel free to provide questions in the Q&A portion of the presentation. We will make sure we get these questions to them. And once again, we want to provide actual factual information. So, for whatever reason, if we cannot answer these questions today, we will have a follow-up so we can get you the information and make sure that it's accurate and timely. So without further ado, we're going to get right into this, and we'll start off. Stacey, if you don't mind leading us through the conversation today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. This is important. Like you said, we must work together between landlords or housing providers and renters and the neighborhoods and the community. So it's real important. So thank you for doing this. It's a great service. My name is Stacy Johnson Cosby. And like you said, I'm president of the KC Regional Housing Alliance. We're an alliance of housing providers and organizations that represent us. So whether it's a property management organization, the realtors, investor groups, or landlord organizations, we're together. And our goal is to speak with one voice, one responsible voice for our industry. I also happen to be a real estate agent. I've been licensed for over 32 or 33 years selling homes in Kansas and Missouri. So housing is really important to me. And it's important that people have housing that is comfortable for them and good for them for the long term, because it helps in the overall security of our community. So that is who I am. Robert.
Hi, thanks for having us. My name is Robert Long. I'm the current president of Landlords Inc. in Kansas City. I am a small business housing provider, providing single family homes in Southeast Kansas City, and have worked years in the multifamily, low income housing industry. I'm also a real estate agent, so I'm all about putting people in houses, and in a number of different ways. So thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Something I should also say too, I should have said this, but my husband and I are also housing providers of over 25, 26 years. We made a choice to invest in housing in Missouri to provide quality housing units for those that need houses. So I should have said that as well.
Well, thank you all for both being with us today. As I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that, us in neighborhood and housing services, that we're providing this opportunity to have these real conversations, because sometimes the conversations they can get testy, And you know, I said we're in a time that, you know, we haven't seen in this country ever. And so what we don't want to have happen, you know, we don't want people in the streets. We don't want people not knowing where they're going to lay their heads at night. So we must make sure that we, you know, provide opportunities to get these, to have these conversations, these civil conversations. And, you know, today I believe you're going to give us some directions on how we can have those conversations in a civil manner. We'll also get into some other some other questions that we've come across in doing our work. So Stacey, if you want to take it from here and lead us into this presentation.
Wonderful. Let me share my screen.
Okay.
Okay. And let me know. Let me go back. Okay. Can you see the screen okay?
Yes.
Yes.
There it is. And so again, we're working together. We love working with the city on important events such as this. And so our goal is to share how we can be successful, because a lot of people think it's us versus them, and it's absolutely not. And we know that it's always best when we have a positive relationship going forward. And so we're going to share our insight from our perspective and our own personal experiences. And of course, there are others out there, but this is just from us today. And so the first thing for our agenda, these are the things we're going to cover. And we know we have a period of time that we need to move through these in. And so we'll be asking for questions at different points throughout the process. And then I think you'll explain how the questions will go. But we're going to talk about what each side's looking for. We're going to talk in a little detail about the actual contracts. And that's where some of the problems happen. We're going to work through that, and then a communication plan. And at the bottom, you'll see some thoughts that we had for future classes. And this is not set, but if people have ideas about what you'd like to have in a class for conversation, we're open to it. I think the city is too. Okay, let's begin. Robert. We're going to talk about what they're looking for.
What is the relationship between a housing provider and renter? The housing provider is looking for a responsible renter who can be successful in completing the lease agreement. They want somebody who will take care of the property and communicate important information in a professional and timely manner. Stacey will tell us about the renter.
And so the renter is looking for the same thing. And so I think it's important. So many times renters don't think that they have the right to be picky about who's going to provide housing for them. It's almost like a business relationship. You need to make sure that the person that you're going to be working with in this rental relationship is someone that you can trust and that is professional and has a communication plan that's good for you. So you should be looking for all of those kind of things. And then you should ask questions. If you feel that there's something that's just not a match, then maybe you need to find another housing provider that works for you. But what I want to say here is we want to empower you with information. You have a choice. You don't have to take just whoever has a property that comes along. And then there may be things, and we're going to talk about them too, that you can say or ask that can improve that relationship. But we want you to identify up front what's important for you in a housing provider. Because again, if it's a 12-month contract, that's a long time. And you need to make sure for all of those 12 months that you have a good relationship for your family, because it's going to make a difference between stress and not. So that's going to be something that I ask for you to think about in advance. And then references is the next thing. And just like any other business, if there's something that you want to ask more about, or if something doesn't, you don't have enough information from your conversation or even your interview with the housing provider, you may ask them for references. You may say, you would like to talk to someone that's rented from you. I have some questions and I just want to hear it from another person. People don't think that they have that right, and they do. This is a consumer relationship. And so that's something, and that would be good for us as housing providers too, if we see someone that is so interested in making sure that the relationship is a fit, that they're asking to talk to one of our one of the tenants or one of our renters, we're absolutely fine with that. It is a business, and you need to make sure you're comfortable going in, and you need to do everything you can up front to make sure that the product that you're about to buy is good for you. Okay.
And so to set the groundwork for the successful housing provider and renter relationship, we have to understand that most of the problems in this relationship come from the either lack of communication or a misunderstanding of whose responsibility various things are. So one of the keys at the beginning of this relationship, even when you're calling to see a house or returning a call, is starting to understand how the other person prefers to communicate. Some people these days want to communicate via text, via email, or phone call. So be open to that other person's style of communication, and pay attention to what the other person is telling you about that.
Absolutely. So there is a choice. Okay, trying to get okay, there we are. Okay, so then we'll briefly touch on this. Where do you find properties to rent? And there are a lot of people that will ask, you know, where can I find a good quality place? And this is something else that starts the relationship out right, is making sure you find someone through a quality source. And so I've just listed a few of the ones that that I know to have accurate listings and good, solid information. Zillow.com, Zumper, Trulia, and Apartments.com. There are others out there, but you can also ask some of your friends and family who they rent from and who they're happy with. Just like any other recommendation, that's always a good question. When you see someone happy in their current situation, who's their housing provider? And then Robert.
So we want to take this opportunity to remind you about scams and things to be aware of. One of the things that hurts the relationship between tenants and landlords is the perception that all landlords are crooks or greedy or whatever. So there are good and bad in every segment of our community. One of the things we see happening is people losing their move-in money due to scams. A common scenario is that a housing provider will put an ad on Zillow for their property. A scammer will copy the ad, take $100 or so off the rent and post the ad on Craigslist. And then, somebody sees what looks to be a great deal. Remember, if it's too good to be true, it just may be. So somebody sees what they think is a great deal. They'll contact the person on Craigslist who will string them along and wind up getting their move-in money. So we want to warn you, don't give money for a house to somebody you haven't met in person, and don't give money down for a house that you haven't seen in person. Somebody who has the authority to rent a house to a tenant can get you inside the house to see it for whatever reason. So don't get sucked into the scams. Check multiple sites to see if you can find the ad elsewhere.
And that's important too, is to make sure if you have a question about it, if something doesn't seem right, you can always go to the court records and verify the owner of the property. If they tell you they're the owner, you want to check the court records and make sure that they are indeed the owner. Most of the time you won't have that problem, but sometimes if you have a feeling about it, or if it comes from Craigslist or something that is not a preferred site, you may want to do some extra due diligence in that. Okay.
Okay, so in the application process, the renter is going to need to provide, tell the housing provider who's going to live in the home, whether the household has pets. Applications will ask about rental credit and criminal history. The landlord will also be looking at the way that the tenant communicates and presents themselves. Both renters and housing providers could look at this similar to how we look at a job interview. You know, we're trying to decide if we want to do business with the person on the other side, regardless of which party you are. So pay attention to those indicators.
Okay, and then submitting the application, again, it's almost like a job application. You want to make sure that it is complete and that you put all of the information on there that's requested and required. And that includes, you'll see information about the security deposit. There'll be an application fee. So it's not unusual if someone charges anywhere from maybe $25 to maybe $50, $65, depending on what background checks they're going to do. And so they'll ask for that typically at the time you make application. And then remember too, that some of them are going to be doing background checks on you. They may be criminal background checks, but they may be credit checks, and they may be checking with your previous landlords for references, or they may do character references. And so we ask that you fill the application out completely and honestly. there's nothing worse than someone putting something on there because they think it'll make their application look better or get approved, and then finding the housing provider later finding out that there was something not honest on there or not correct on there. And so it's always important to be honest. And if there was a problem, let them know what it was. You know, there's a gap in my employment history or in my rental history because, you know, I was living with a family member, I was out of state, or I was in prison. I mean, it happens, you know, things happen. So just be honest, as honest and complete as you can on the application, and talk to the housing provider and make sure you understand what they're looking for and what they're asking for with the application. Again, towards communication and making sure it's all in order and you set the tone up front.
And,
Excuse me, I'm sorry, just a quick question. Is the application fee, is that ever a negotiable between an applicant and a housing provider? What I've been hearing, and we've been getting a lot of questions on, is sometimes the disparity in application fees. Is that, you know, if you have somebody who's kind of shopping for different housing providers, and then one is saying, hey, there's a 25, 35, somewhere in that range that Stacy may have mentioned, and there's somebody saying, hey, there's a $125 application fee. I've gotten those questions. So is there, you know, is that ever negotiable?
well, I would say if you don't ask, you don't get, right? Everything's negotiable until it's written down on a paper. Now, the flip side of that is the housing provider has to practice fair housing. So he needs to have a standard application fee. But, you know, it's certainly worth a question. And wow, $125 application fee, huh?
Yes, they're very real.
And addition to that question, also, let's just say the application fee is $125. Would it be lawful for the prospective tenant to ask what that particular fee is going for, other than a standard answer of administrative fees? Is that legal for them to ask?
Of course, absolutely. And this is again with communication. And remember too, different housing providers use different services to screen. So I may use a company that charges me $25 and I may pass that cost on. I may add $5 onto it for administrative costs. And it depends. If they do various checks, a security check may cost a little bit more. If they do a basic credit check, that may be very standard basic cost. So it depends on what they're screening for and what they're paying for it. So that's why the numbers may vary across the way, but it never hurts to ask. As a matter of fact, that opens the communication up front. Can you tell me why the fee is this much and what you're going to be looking at? So that's a fair question and a good way to start out so that there's no question or ambiguity about that going forward.
Absolutely.
One final thing to point out there is just like everywhere else, we shop for housing with our dollars and our choices. You know, so if somebody's charging you fees that are double what everybody else is charging you, you have to start to question yourself as to whether or not you want to do business in that high-end environment, you know?
Thank you.
You have choices, you know, that you can choose to ask the question, or if it's too high, you know, go somewhere else. It's unfortunate, but I mean, but that is just like any other business relationship and a product at any like store or retail. You always ask the question, and I would encourage that, always ask questions. Okay, are there any other questions before we move on quickly? Okay, and so reasons for denial. And so again, just like we just talked about, there may be, when they do the credit checks, there may be something on the credit report that may cause a problem. Maybe it's a past student loan or medical debt or credit cards that have been in collection, or a lot of 30-day lates. There are reasons for applications to be denied. And if it's a credit issue, it could be one of those. It could be rental history. Maybe when they check with your past housing providers, they say, yeah, they pay the rent on time, but there were always complaints about noise, or there were always, you know, issues about having loud parties or having many people over, or people, you know, living in the property that shouldn't be there, or they had pets. So there are always things to do, and we're going to talk about, and it's important for you to think about making sure that when you move, that your current housing provider can provide a positive rental reference for you too. And then evictions, that's something else that causes a person to be denied. And many people are talking about evictions nowadays, but I just want you to see from a different perspective, perhaps, that an eviction means that someone lived in a property, they signed a contract that said, I'm going to pay rent on the first of each month, I'm going to do all these other things. And at some point, the majority of evictions for non-payment of rent. So at some point, if they stop paying the rent, then the housing provider says, hey, I have a mortgage payment, I have taxes, I have insurance, I have to be able to pay my cost. And so they may be forced to the point as a last resort to go to court to evict the person for breach of contract. And in that case, that is on your credit record. People are going to look at that and say, hey, if they didn't pay that housing provider, there's a good possibility they're not going to pay me. And so you have to be very careful. It's just like a person with an auto loan. If you've had a car repossessed for non-payment, and then someone checks that reference, it's going to come back to you. So that's the reason why people are evicted. Why eviction is used as a reason for denial. It's legitimate, but one thing that I will say is talk to the housing provider when you make the application. My husband always asks people, have you been evicted? And most of them they're going to be honest and say, yes, I have. He'll say, what were the circumstances? And that you get caught up and get it paid off with the past housing provider. If that's the case, we don't have a problem with it, because it's like, we're all human, things happen. But it's the ones that say, no, I've never been evicted, and then we find out they have been, and that's a bad start. But just be honest and explain, because we all know that things happen, and the majority of us will probably work with someone that's been evicted, but we need to know the circumstances. And then another reason may be insufficient income. Maybe you just don't make enough to qualify. If the rent is, $700 a month and your income is $900 a month, that's going to be a problem, because we're going to say there are going to be months where something's going to happen and rent may not get paid. So we're looking at income, and that's something to ask the housing provider. Do they have a certain income limit or requirement before you pay for the application, just to make sure you kind of preserve your dollars. And that's something else. It's another good thing to ask. What are you looking for in a tenant? What do you need from me with this application? And then unpaid balances. Again, if we see on the credit report that you have 3 or 4 credit cards with balances due and a car repossessed, that's going to make an impact. And then just again, false information or missing or not sharing something with us. Honesty is the best way to start the relationship. And you'll know that our goal is to rent the property. So we want to, every time we meet someone at a property, our goal is, please let this be the one. We want to rent to you. And so let's try to find a way to make that happen. Okay. Are there any questions, Robert?
Go ahead. Do we have any questions so far?
Let's see. Robert Loya, do we have any questions?
Okay. So if there are none, so just my key here is to figure out how to overcome it. And that's by talking to that housing provider and explaining the situation and asking if they'll work with you. And some of them
Sorry, guys. No, I am good. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay. And so anyway, so communication is the key. You may not be perfect, but I'll bet not very many of the people who apply are perfect, but you need to work with the person at application to say, I want you to work with me. I have some issues. And when they get the application pulled, go back again and talk to them. If they say you're denied, say why, and then see if, again, the negotiation, if it's because, of a past due credit card, I paid it off, I have a receipt. Or will you work with me if I give you an extra month's security deposit? So there are ways to overcome a denial. Don't stop the conversation. Just like with any other product that you want, you don't just stop after they tell you no the first time. You ask a little bit more and see if they'll work with you. Okay.
Okay, so I spoke earlier about a common problem being misunderstanding and miscommunication. And that's all about understanding what the lease agreement is. But before we go there, I want to point out, Stacy mentioned the importance of the applicant disclosing information on the application. But there's also law in Kansas City, Missouri, that requires landlords to consider additional information provided by a tenant with a history of eviction or criminal history. And so most of our applications have a spot that says, please provide any additional information that you wish to be considered. And quite often that isn't filled out. So that's a great opportunity to complete that information and explain that situation. The city of Kansas City, Missouri also requires the landlord to disclose to the tenant before signing a lease a copy of the tenant's bill of rights and a property condition disclosure that says whether or not the property has been cited for violations. So it's important for the housing provider to be upfront and disclose information as well as we enter this process. And then we need to make sure that everybody understands and reviews the lease, which is a roadmap to how the agreement will go. Quite often, I've done hundreds of leases, and quite often people just, you'll hand somebody a 4 or 5 page lease, and people will so often just sign it to get the keys so they, so they can get home and start moving. I make a point to go over certain things that, I want to make sure that the tenant understands on day one. And so it's really important to read that lease, because that's what sets the expectations. It defines the terms of the agreement, the occupants, the pets, lease term, whether the rent, the fee amounts, and deposit amounts. It also defines rights and responsibility and who is responsible for certain things. Any changes to the lease terms, well, let me back up. The lease should be signed by all parties, right? And dated. Any changes to the lease terms should also be in writing and acknowledged by all the parties. So it's important. It's really important to understand what that lease says, because so often people are saying, well, I didn't know I couldn't do that, or not understanding why there's a problem. And if you have a problem, the first thing you should do is look to the lease and see what it says, see what that agreement is and who's responsible for what. Next,
let me jump in real quick.
Go ahead, Stacy.
I think a lot of problems come as a result of something in that lease. And then remember upfront, if the housing provider gives you a lease, make sure you take, like Robert said, take the time to read that lease. And if there's something in there that doesn't sound right to you, again, open the negotiations. You may say to the housing provider, hey, I want to change this clause or this term, and see if you're able to get that done. It's not written that they'll change it, because some of them have standard leases that they will always use. And it doesn't hurt to ask the question if there's something that you'd like to change in the lease at that point up front. But if nothing else, know your lease. And then, like Robert says, if something changes along the line, like in the beginning when you signed the lease, if you don't have a dog, but then all of a sudden you get a dog, you want to go back, make sure the housing provider is okay with you having it, and then you want to get an addendum to that lease and get a document signed stating, hey, I know that there's a dog there and here are the terms. And whatever changes you have to that lease, get them in writing. It's not good enough for you to say, oh, I talked to the housing provider or the landlord about it and we're okay. Get it in writing, because if you find yourself in court one day, you need to be able to say, no, here's the documentation. And that's a good point for housing providers and for renters too. Everything must be in writing, any changes, because that's what counts in court. And that's a good guiding document for your relationship.
All right. So we want to touch briefly on security deposit. This is an important issue that often creates a lot of conflict between the housing provider and the renter. So again, the amount of the security deposit is defined in the lease. In Missouri, the law says that a security deposit can't exceed 2 times the monthly rent amount. So again, that will be different based on different landlords and based on an applicant's history. But if you have a housing provider telling you they need 3 times the rent amount, that's not acceptable in the state of Missouri. The deposit is refundable, or it's used to be applied to charges for damages or balances owed to the housing provider after move out. The deposit can't be used by the tenant for the last month's rent. You can't just say, oh, here's my notice, I'm moving out, I'm not going to pay rent for the last month. Missouri state law says that if the tenant does that, the landlord can charge 2 times the monthly rent amount for that last month's rent. Then the law also states that the housing provider must return a deposit or accounting of the deposit to explain how it was used or applied within 30 days from the lease termination date. And if they don't do that, the penalty for that can be up to 2 times the improperly returned amount. So there are responsibilities for, again, both the tenant and the housing provider, but it's important to understand those basic guidelines are there. and make sure whoever you're dealing with follows them.
If I can say really quickly, the reason you may say, why aren't they talking about this? We're talking about relationships and positive relationships. These are the areas where people usually get stuck. And so our point is in bringing them up is that everybody's empowered on both sides of that transaction, that the housing provider knows what their options are, and the renter knows as well. You need to know that these are things that are important and that are going to come up later, and that you need to be aware of. And the more aware you are, the better questions you ask up front and the better clarification you have going in. Because when you have a problem with something in the lease, if you know what it says up front and you can work through it, then that resolves that tension right there. And the same with the deposit. You don't have to worry at the end that there's going to be a fight with the housing provider, because you know what your rights are and what the security deposit covers. And so that's the reason we're bringing these things up. Are there any questions for us before we move on?
Yeah, Stacy, I see a question from Roxana Schaff or Shafee.
Okay, I think Robert is going to get that to us. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Robert,
Okay.
what do we have?
Hi guys, sorry. It was not responding. I'm going to Q&A now. Answer live. First question. Can landlords ask for additional deposit and claim that credit is the reason?
Robert, you want to take that?
Sure. So yes, the landlord can ask for anywhere up to 2 times the rent amount. And what the landlord is doing is they're trying to, through the application process, gauge the risk of problems. So the security deposit helps ensure that. So that can be set, and it's often based on either credit or rental history, or perhaps if somebody's didn't have a like 2 years worth of income history or something of that nature. But again, that's also negotiable. So if they say something, you can ask them if there's anything that they can do to reduce that to help ensure it, to help them make them feel better.
A way to look at that, like why should I have to?
I have to go play. I gotta do this. Thank you.
Oh, okay. I wanted to just add on to that question really quickly here. And again, like Robert's saying, why, from our mind, why would we ask for that? Think about us as a creditor. Though we're everyday people just like you, this is a business for us, and we're entrepreneurs. This is our small business. And if you have a 12-month lease and your rent is $500 a month, that's $6,000. So in a sense, I'm going to be extending $6,000 worth of credit to you, and I need to feel comfortable that I'm going to get that back over the next 12 months. And so if it means that maybe I ask for a little more of a security deposit, because I see in the past there may have been some late payments, if it makes me feel better, then you may understand that it may make it worth the risk for me. So that's from their mind. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. And if you know that there are things on your credit report, and then the housing provider may be inclined to turn you down, you may offer, hey, I'll pay an additional security deposit because I know that my past credit, may not be good, but I will do better, and I'm doing better now. So it's something else that is, it can be a negotiation tool in your contract.
Okay, if we're ready for the next one, we have a few more.
Yeah, we are.
The first part goes, it says, what recourse do tenants have when a landlord has asked for more than 2 times the rent for deposit when they cite credit history is the issue? And the second follow-up to that was poor credit.
I really don't know. I guess you could talk to, I saw on Channel 2, the Human Relations Department, or you just explain to that. I would first say to the landlord, hey, I don't think that's legal. According to Missouri law, I thought you could only charge 2 times the rent amount. I'm not sure where a complaint would go from that, but we also have the Office of the Tenant Advocate, or Kansas City, Missouri Human Relations Department.
And that's something I would suggest people do. You know your rights. So if you Google landlord tenant law in Missouri, you can get, and the document is fairly easy to read. Know your rights. Look at that document, because people always talk about, can I withhold my rent if the landlord doesn't fix or make a repair? All of that is addressed in plain language on the website, and by Googling it, you can pull that up. And it's important for both the housing provider and the tenant to know what those rights are. Because again, if you know upfront going in, then there's less room for a disagreement. But all of that is spelled out there. And so if someone is asking you to do something that's against the law, you can merely provide them with a copy of that and say it is against the law. Here's Missouri landlord tenant law. And so that
I believe that's even in KCMO's Tenant Bill of Rights. I think that's addressed in there as well.
Yeah, yes, and what we'll work on after this is that, to specifically address that question, is that once again, we want to be factual and make sure our information is accurate. So we'll make sure that we, as a follow-up to this, after the presentation, we'll get this information out to the person who's asking that question, and we'll try to provide it on our website as well, a question and answer to that, because there's several different resources that are out there, and some people are more internet savvy than others, so we'll make sure we get some accurate information. But that was definitely a good question.
And if I could also say that legal aid is available. If there's a tenant that has a question that's a legal question, they can call legal aid too. So that way you're not trying to interpret law. Even though I think it's well written, you may just pick up the phone and call an attorney. And if you don't have an attorney, perhaps legal aid may be able to answer that. Because I agree with you, Sean, that getting the right information that is solid is real important too. I agree. Okay, you have some more questions for us, Robert Loya?
Yes, there are 3 more. The first one being, if a tenant has a certified service animal, can a landlord deny a tenant?
And this is one, again, that I would say talk to an attorney about, because that is something that you want to be 100% sure about. So if you don't, if you need that answered, if you don't have an attorney, please check with legal aid to answer that.
But I would add to that there are strong rights for legitimately verified and certified service animals.
Mm-hmm.
So, the answer to that is generally no, but it depends on the situation. There's a lot of gray area there, but certified service animals should be accepted by the housing provider.
And I'm glad that question came up, because that is something that we have been seeing an uptick in questions, and it's always a gray area. With the city of Kansas City, we try to stay out of the gray, but as far as directing them towards accurate information, to be honest, the information is fluid. I mean, we do see the airline industries are dealing with this right now,
right.
And so we knew it was a matter of time before we started hitting our neighborhood. So once again, it's a gray area, but if we can get more accurate information, we'll make sure we provide those resources.
Okay.
A few more questions?
Yes. Next question. If your landlord refuses to communicate with you in person or in writing, what should they do?
Okay, this is something that we talked about before. And what I know is that there's not necessarily an official mechanism through the city, but there is a conflict resolution company that's out there, an organization that's out there that may be willing to help people with conflicts, neighborhood conflicts and situations like this in our city. And so I think that it's important to know that there's an organization out there. And what I'll do is I'll type it in the chat before we finish today so that you have access to that information. And that's something else that we're going to look and see if there are any other options, but that is out there, and I'll put it in chat for you.
And I would add, I tell this to fellow housing providers when they're having issues, and I tell it to tenants who tell me when they're having issues. Document, if you're having problems communicating, whether you're the tenant or the housing provider, document that communication. We have several ways we can do that these days. The easiest way is send them an email. You can write them a letter, but an email is it's easy to show when you sent it and what you sent. So document your efforts to communicate. Then you'd be surprised at how, before as email was becoming a thing, I can remember if you talked to somebody on the phone, you had an agreement, maybe later that wasn't the agreement. As email came out, if you emailed somebody, you can pull it up and say, hey, this is what we talked about. Or, this is my attempt to notify you of this situation. So document. Email is best, but even text is fine if you save that text. It's a little harder to print out and generate and verify.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as well, making sure we have accurate information. I did find out that the city, we do have a a contract with the Center for Conflict Resolution. We'll put this information in the chat, or we'll try to add an additional slide, but the Center for Conflict Resolution, we do have some pre-eviction services, mediation that they do provide. Their phone number, and once again, we'll get this out to you guys, but the phone number is 816-461-8255. And so there will also be a resource. We'll get that in the chat as well, that information in the chat. But the Center for Conflict Resolution can help those pre-eviction things to try to help people, keep people in their homes. So we'll definitely get that information out there. Mr. Lawyer, I know we have a few more questions, but we're going to let them get a little further along in the presentation. You know, we want to be mindful of time. We'll try to get those additional questions as we move forward. So if you guys want to take us forward in the presentation.
We have 4 more questions, just so you know. There's 4 questions in the queue.
Okay.
We're almost at the end. So I did put that in the chat, the Center for Conflict Resolution. They're on Paseo. And so that is in chat because they are great for any kind of conflict, neighborhoods and this type of situation too. Okay, so very good. All right, next slide. Life as a renter, rights and responsibilities. I think this is me. And so these are things that we've talked about. This is pulling it together. The regular maintenance, you need to make sure you're clear about that. Who does what? The housekeeping is your responsibility. If there are emergencies, make sure your contract, your lease spells out who you contact. Right of entry. Housing providers in the Bill of Rights will has to give you a certain amount of time before they enter the property. Renter's insurance is going to be in your lease. Make sure you're taken care of. We just saw recently on the news where there was a fire in an apartment complex. And if you were a tenant, it may have been in your lease to have renter's insurance. But it's important to know that renter's insurance would protect you in the event that there is a fire or burglary or whatever it is, that you have some coverage for your documents. And a lot of people don't, for your items, a lot of people don't think about renter's insurance. But that's something else that can be a right for you to have, and you're paying for it. It's usually less than a couple $100s a year, and it covers and protects your items inside the house. The landlord, the housing provider covers the building, renter's insurance covers your items. And so you may check with the person who has your car insurance or another insurance agency about cost. Painting and making changes, again, it's spelled out in your lease. Can you alter the property? Your housing provider may be okay with it. They may say, go ahead and paint it, but paint it back to the original color before you leave. Or they may say, do not paint it. You want to make sure you know who can do what in the house. Make sure you have your smoke detectors that are working. And it's important, again, we talked about the fire, that it's your responsibility. If they're beeping, if the battery's out, get the battery and put it in there to make sure it's a working smoke detector. If you don't have one and it needs to be done, just reach out to your housing provider. If it's in your lease, did they maintain it? You double check and ask them to take care of it. And extermination, if there are pest issues, usually the person who is there will see them, but then many times they're the cause of them. But many times the lease calls for us as the housing provider to take care of it, but there are things that you can do to prevent them. And so your lease may call for you to take care of it, or may call for your housing provider. And then locks on the door. If you want it, sometimes people have roommates that change and you want to change the locks. You want to, again, go back to your lease. Does your lease allow you to have locks or to change the locks? And if you do you need to get a copy to your housing provider? And so number 2, again, follow the lease. If there are any disputes, before you call the housing provider, you want to make sure it's in the lease. I'll tell you this too. We've had tenants that would literally, and now this is going back to number 1, that will call my husband to come and change a light bulb. Now, something like that is something that you want to make sure up front, that you make sure if it's in the lease that you're supposed to do it, take care of it. Go get a $2 light bulb, change your light bulbs to it. It again builds on the relationship, and it shows that you're responsible inside your own home. And so the lease would dictate, what the issues are. So if you have a problem, first thing you do, go back to the lease. Who's responsible for this, or what's supposed to happen there? What are my rights within the lease? And then number 3, the communication plan. We talked about that a lot today. And a lot of the relationship and a lot of breakdowns are based on communication. Robert mentioned it earlier. You make sure you find out from your housing provider how to reach them. If there's a plumbing backup, if there's an electrical problem, the furnace is not working, how do you reach them? Do they want a text message? Do they want an email? Is there a certain form that you must fill out? Do you need to call them? And then, of course, everything you do, you document. But making sure you know what the communication is ideal, because if the housing provider doesn't check their voicemail and you leave voicemail messages and they're watching for a text, you're going to be upset that this furnace has been, not repaired for 3 or 4 days. So make sure you talk and you tell them the best way to reach and communicate with you as well. And again, half of the problems that many of the problems we have are based around communication. So let's outline that up front and make sure it's clear. And then when it's time to leave, make sure you understand your lease and that you put in your proper notice. Again, another responsibility to make sure you get that security deposit back or that you leave on good terms. One of the things that we ask for some of our, when we check references for our renters, we may ask the previous landlord one magical question. Would you rent to this person again? And then I would like you as a renter to always have that answer yes, which means that you've done everything according to the lease, you fulfilled it in every way possible in the way that it was supposed to, so that this current housing provider that you have will say yes when it's time for the next one when they check the lease. And it's also building your credit too, that you can look back and say, I have 12 months of positive credit in my rental situation. So it's a helpful thing in many ways. Okay, and so on the other side of that is the landlord.
Okay, so from the landlord's perspective, or looking at the landlord's responsibilities, most leases and the city regulations require the landlord to maintain the systems, you know, the HVAC systems, the plumbing, electrical systems. And so that, but again, that's going to be defined in the lease. Also, landlords are required to maintain appliances which they provided within the lease. Right to access, you know, the city defined that the housing provider should give the landlord at least 24 hours written notice. There are sometimes, in the event of an emergency, there are exceptions for that. Stacy touched on the landlord has a right to have a key to the lock, but entering without permission or without notice is generally unacceptable, except for in the event of an emergency. Again, we have to refer to the lease to see who's responsible for what as it relates to pest control, renter's insurance, etc. Stacy mentioned changing a light bulb. Now, if you're a special needs household, you know, it might be reasonable to ask your housing provider to help with something that you're not physically able to do. So when you're reviewing that lease, that's a good time to discuss those things, to say, hey, I'm going to need a little extra help in this area. Again, that's all negotiable, right? We just need to get it out up front. We need to understand how to submit maintenance requests and other info to the housing provider. I have a website and I ask all of my tenants to go to that and submit their maintenance requests there. I wanted to touch on in the emergency situation, if your housing provider isn't responding, if you sent an email and they didn't respond that way, and it's a real emergency, try another method of communication, send a text or pick up the phone. You know, if somebody that usually emails me calls me, or I see them pop up on the caller log and that's unusual, I know that there might be something up. So don't be afraid to try that second method if you're not getting the response in a timely manner. Again, with questions about any of these things, go back to the lease and see what the lease tells you it's supposed to do. Then finally, when it's time to end the lease, you know, again, it's weird that I get happy about having to give somebody money when they're moving out of my house. But that's the goal, you know, is to have to give somebody their deposit back, because that means there's not a lot I have to do to be able to rent the house again. So in order for that to happen, we need to make sure that whether it's the housing provider or tenant, that they give proper notice to terminate the lease and leave the property in the condition it was found, and that the housing provider does return that security deposit or accounting.
Can I interject here real quick?
Sure.
It's just that one question that I get quite a bit is and you kind of touched on it, is that defining what emergencies are, because what an emergency for the tenant may not be an emergency for the housing provider. So that's one that I get a bunch, you know, like, hey, my toilet was clogged or whatever the case may be. I mean, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's definitely an inconvenience, but having that clear set of expectations of what constitutes an emergency is one that we get quite a bit.
That's a great question, and that's one we get quite a bit. And I've started defining that a little more in my lease agreement that says these things are emergencies. But, you know, clearly, no heat in the winter is an emergency. To me, and every housing provider, you know, if I have a list of 10 different service things I need to do in the next few days, I'm prioritizing them based on level of seriousness, right? So to me, running water is a really big deal, because look at the water bills that that we receive in Kansas City, Missouri. So that's a huge deal. Any kind of safety issue is an emergency, but I don't know, it's hard to come up with what is not an emergency after that, but.
Let me say this, if I could. An emergency that would require someone, the housing provider, to enter the home without all of the advance notice, that's a different story. I think, like, for example, a couple of weeks ago, my niece, who lives in an apartment, the neighbor upstairs had water running and it overflowed into her apartment. And so if that neighbor was out of town or not home, then the housing provider, I can understand the management having to go in and stop the water. You know, if the person didn't answer, if they couldn't give a written notice, something like that is something that would require that a person go into the property if they couldn't reach the renter. Most of the other things, like what Robert was talking about, are things that, you know, you can build a list and just go over and take care of. Like, my husband will hardly ever go into a property without the tenant there. He just will not do it. He always wants them to be there when he's going into the property. And it's a very, very rare situation that he'll go in. Even if they say, you know, just go ahead and go in, he usually wants them there to meet him for whatever work is being done. And very rarely, if they're at work and someone needs to be let in, he will talk to them and handle, you know, getting the person in that needs to go in there for the repair. But it usually takes an extreme emergency to go in without working it out in advance. We do not like to invade anyone's privacy, because that is their home, and going into it without permission or a very valid reason, we're just not going to do it.
It's important to understand, though, that there are times that we have to be flexible in when that maintenance can be done. I've had a tenant say, well, I want you to come between 6 and 7 p.m. because that's the only time I'm going to be home to address this issue. So we have to provide maintenance at a time when the vendor, the person that's doing the repair, is available to do it. And I always prefer to send a contractor when the tenant's home, because I don't have to deal with that. But there are times when we have to work in somebody's home when they're not home in order to get something done. So again, it's a communication thing and trying to respect each other's preferences.
Right.
Let me interject here as well. Again, I know we're getting close to the close of the presentation you all have prepared, but we have quite a few questions in the Q&A session. So we want to make sure that we provide accurate time for that. So if you guys are prepared, we would like to, you know, get close to ending this presentation with the questions that we have. So, Mr. Lawyer, I'm sorry.
I just say perfect timing because we're at the end.
Okay, good. Mr. Lawyer, what do we have in the Q&A session?
We actually have 8 questions now.
Oh,
the first one, if you are behind in rent, can your landlord demand your stimulus payment for back rent?
No, your landlord has no access to your stimulus payment. You know, your landlord could suggest to you that you might use your stimulus payment to help get caught up, but you know, the money that you use to pay your rent, the source that you use to pay your rent from, is your business.
Right.
Okay. Next question. What recourse do the homeowners in high rental areas have? We buy houses are put up everywhere. Dumpsters and trash litter the neighborhood. Homeowners are being left out of the conversation.
311. 311. Right? Is that, I mean, that's just the best answer. If someone's violating the property maintenance code, they need to call 311.
And be a part of the conversation. You know, several years ago, we realized that housing providers weren't really part of the conversation of what happens in our city related to our industry. So we pay attention to city council meetings where these things are being discussed. We pay attention to community meetings. So it is quite possible to become part of the conversation in Kansas City, Missouri. The city does a really good job of ensuring that.
And if I can say this really quickly, if it's a short term, if they're buying the house and renovating it and eliminating blight in that neighborhood, you may give them some grace over a certain period of time, and give them time to get it cleaned up, because many times these houses have sat vacant for months or years on end. So if they're trying to clean up the property, maybe be grateful for that part of it. But if it's going on just a tad bit too long and it's just not being contained, you may then call 311. Let me calm down a little bit. I'm thinking with my neighborhood hat on, because I wouldn't want to see that either, but I would like to see a property turned around. Okay, we're ready for another question.
Okay. How many application fees can a landlord collect and keep before they rent the property?
That's a tough question. I think what you're referring to is somebody taking applications more for fees than for renting the property. And I don't think that there's any limit to that. But I certainly wouldn't want to do business with somebody if I felt that was what was going on. And don't be afraid to ask if you're getting ready to, before you pay an application fee, the tenant should say, look, here's my history and the things that might cause me to be denied. Does it make sense? What are my odds of being accepted with this history? And then the other thing to ask is, how many applications do you currently have on this property? And if you don't feel like you're getting an honest answer, then again, we shop with our choices and our dollars. And so find somebody that you feel more comfortable about doing business with, because not everybody does that.
And I have to say that most of us will take one application at a time, because again, remember, we're not trying to turn people down. We are hoping that this person that's looking at the property today is our magical person. We want that person to be approved. And so if you have an application and the person, for whatever reason, let's say there are things on the credit report that you just can't accept as a housing provider, and you turn them down. And sometimes it's not unusual to maybe go through 3, 4, or 5 applicants before you find one that will work and will be a fit for the property. So if the reason they're turning them down is because of a valid, reason, then that's something else to look at as well. It's not always a bad thing. They may just be trying to find the person that's the right fit for them and have had some challenges. That's happened to us before. You have another question for us?
Okay, next question. During COVID-19 guidelines, can a tenant refuse entry to the landlord if they are a high-risk person?
It's a good question. I would say that for me, my initial response on that is going to be that's a legal question, but then these are special times, so that's something that a lawyer may be able to answer, what the rights are in that case for both parties. But then look at it from the point of view of a housing provider. We've had a couple of our tenants that had COVID, but if they have an emergency in their unit, my husband has to go in. And so he's, front lines and an essential worker. So we have to look at it from that point of view. And so just keep in mind that we're human too, and everybody wants to be safe on both sides. I think, Robert, you were going to add something?
I would just say, to consider the severity of the situation. We're all dealing with things that we never thought we'd imagine. And, as the pandemic started, I was really aware of being in other people's homes. And we try to limit that for minor things. There are cases where, if you've got a faucet shooting water out up into the sky, somebody's going to have to come in and deal with that. But, work with your housing provider if it's urgent. You may have to find a way to do it where everybody's comfortable. I heard Healthy Homes Department, if they enter a tenant's home, they will be masked and they will require the people in the home to be masked. But again, that's on the tenant's permission.
And another quick thing here, if you, as a renter, if you have several things that come up, again, back to the making the list. Maybe you keep your housing provider, say, hey, there's a little problem with a leak over here. I want you to know, but I have COVID and I'm still within my quarantine period. and keep a list of those things that are non-emergency and non-urgent, so that when they, you know, when the time is right and you feel safe and comfortable letting them in, and when it's safe for them to go in, then they can go in and just cover all of those things at once. But keep them posted as you go along on what the issues are, because they do need to be made aware if there are any problems or issues in the property, and that's a good way to do it. And then just keep the list.
Okay. Next question. What is the general feeling on lease templates generated by rental websites? For example, apartments.com lets a landlord generate a lease document it claims is legal and specific to a given U.S. state.
I would suggest that anybody that's working up a lease communicate with local attorneys so that they're aware of the local ordinances. Apartments.com perhaps doesn't know about the requirements of KCMO Tenant Bill of Rights, for example. So again, get with local attorneys, or Landlords Inc. Provides a lease for its members to use. There are a lot of resources out here locally to use.
That's a good point. And if it is a general lease that's non-specific, again, legal aid is an option for you. If you're a renter, you may call them to ask, you know, for them to look at the lease or to see what they're what they can do to help you with that.
Okay. It says, I think it's a typo, but I think it's supposed to say, you may cover modification of property to accompanied property for a handicapped person.
It's a little deep for our conversation today, but we'll just say that there are rights that a handicapped person or a disabled person has for what are considered reasonable modifications. Again, the city probably has a department that can advise on that.
Right, and I would point again people to look at law. If you need to Google Missouri landlord tenant law, that is covered there. And then again, if you need to reach out to an attorney, if you don't have one, again, legal aid. I mean, they're there for use. Let's use them and get legal representation if you need it, or at least an opinion from them.
And for a future session, we will try to reach out and have some representation from the whole person available, because we are getting a lot of ADA questions, and we just want to make sure we get accurate information. So we will be having them out on the future session. Ms. Lloyd, how many more questions do we have?
We have 3 more questions. Yeah. The first one, if you have a language barrier with your landlord, what should you do?
So there are a couple of different resources. We've had to deal with this before. Kansas City has a language institute. Where there are students learning language. So you can reach out to them and see if perhaps they have a student that can help you. Also, different groups have community centers. So see if either the housing provider or the prospective tenant has somebody that can help with that translation.
Okay, next question. Landlords are supposed to register with the city. Is that being enforced?
The requirement just recently passed. All landlords were to be registered by December 31st. I know that I've registered the properties which I'm responsible for, and I received notices from the city reminding me of my responsibility to do so. I also know that when Healthy Homes gets a complaint, that's checked to see if the property is properly registered. So I'd say there's certainly a visible attempt to enforce that registration requirement.
And I would say that I know that they don't have 100% of all rental properties registered. I've seen meetings where they were reporting out on that. But if you have a question about a registration, you can call the health department at Healthy Homes to ask the question there. And the problem is that a lot of the majority of the housing providers out there that follow the laws and the rules, they know about that. But there are some of them that just simply don't. But calling the health department would be the best way to find out if a property has been registered.
All right, thank you. The last one actually appears to be more of a comment. It says 311 is too slow.
That's what we have. But then remember too, if I can say this too, remember we have the Office of the Housing Advocate in City Hall, or it's called the tenant advocate, but it's actually housing advocate. That's a person that is a resource person that's going to be helpful for housing providers and renters. That if you have a question that is related to our industry, Tiffany Drummer should be able to answer those questions for you. I would not hesitate to call her because she is a resource for us in our rental industry.
And I would, yeah, I was gonna say, I definitely agree with that. 311, I mean, I understand, you know, it is subjective on the speed of something. I mean, obviously, if there's an emergency, you know, it should be communicated with the housing provider. But 311, there is a set protocol for how they route calls. I mean, they're dealing with hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of calls a day. So making sure they route these calls to the accurate folks is something that may or may not, you know, have to do with the speed of it. Making sure you get accurate information. So, you know, don't beat up on 311 too much. They're doing a great job and a great service, but they are a resource. And just make sure we get these to accurate places is great. Speaking of Tiffany Drummer, we definitely will have her on a future session as well. She's a great resource with the city of Kansas City. So we'll make sure we bring her on and she can clarify what she does and the services she provides. So with that being said, we're gonna end this session. This is a very thought-provoking session, very informative, and it takes a lot of the gray area out. And so with that being said, we want to thank you all both for participating. We can look forward to some future sessions. We may even want to bring this session back as well in the future. We have your contact information if they want to reach out to you directly. Of course, we're here at Landlord Tenant University.
And you can always reach out to us here at the city if you have questions about future classes or any types of resources that we can possibly help you find to resolve your problem. And you can always reach out to us via email at landlord.university@KCMO.gov, or if it's a tenant related issue, you can reach us at tenant.university@KCMO.gov, or you can always call Sean and I on the phone at 816-513-9054 or 816-513-9024. And we will be more than happy to answer any questions that you have or direct you to the right resource for your issue.
So once again,
one more thing, guys.
Question? Yes, sir.
Sorry, the comment was actually followed up. It says 311 is great. It says the process is too slow. That's all. I just want to let you know that was the last thing that popped up.
Well, great deal. And we will get this to 311 as well, so that they can be aware of you know, any holes in their processes that can be, you know, looked at to make everything better. Because, you know, once again, we're all in this together. We want to make our neighborhoods better, and we want the communication gaps to be closed. So you guys have done a great job in doing that. And we have your contact information if they want to reach out to you. So we're going to end on that note, and we're going to say, look to our websites and our contact information for future sessions. We truly appreciate you all today, and that's a wrap.
Absolutely. And remember, you can also find this recording on our YouTube page on the City of Kansas City Communications page. So if you know someone that is in desperate need of this particular information or any other information that we can provide, you're more than welcome to find us there. Or you can email us or give us a call and we'll get the information to you. Thank you all for joining us today. We thoroughly appreciate it. We've enjoyed this time that we've had together, and we'll see you on our next session of Landlord and Tenant University.
Have a good day.
Have a good day.